half my time on stage was slightly equivalent to torture. Painful, agonizingly self-conscious, hyper-aware of every little thing, and relentlessly self-critical. For many people, public speaking is equivalent to agony. If you give them very concrete things that they can do and succeed at, they can get past this agonizing moment and experience a little tiny brief moment of victory. So it was this really powerful moment of kinesthetic learning.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Welcome to the Action Catalyst. Today's guest is Michael Chad Hoeppner, the founder and CEO of GK Training, a firm dedicated to giving individuals, companies, and organizations the communication skills to reach their highest goals in work and life. He's a coach, a professor, and a curriculum designer at Columbia Business School, as well as the author of the new book, Don't Say How to Communicate Effectively to Live a Better Life. Michael, thank you so much for making the time. I was really looking forward to this conversation for many reasons, one of which is that both my parents were opera singers.
Yeah, I knew that. I mean, I, of course, did a little research about you, and that's the coolest thing because you have already a shorthand vocabulary for a lot of this. And my parents, similar, were both professional cellists.
Wow.
Yeah, similar kind of artistic passion. But yeah, my mom, in fact, is retiring from the Colorado Symphony Orchestra after 63 years.
Wow.
Symphony Orchestra. Yeah, my dad played more than 50. So together, they have something absurd, like 115 years in the symphony or something crazy.
That's amazing. You can tell your parents that I was temporarily dedicated to the cello until we moved to Boone, North Carolina, and my parents decided to relocate our house about a half mile from where the bus would drop you off uphill. And in order for me to practice, I had to slug that thing all the way home and quickly lost my inspiration.
Time to switch to violin, right? Or is this
Exactly.
piccolo or the triangle?
The triangle sounded like that would have been a good choice. Well, that's amazing. So yeah, I can relate a lot to what it's like to grow up with music. And there's part of your story I was really curious about, which is, what was your initial inspiration to become one day?
Hilariously, nothing of the kind. I come from a blended family, 8 of us kids all together, and none pursued professional music. So I don't know if it skips a generation or what that would be, but I actually was focused on, I wanted to be a paleontologist or an archaeologist or a marine biologist, and that obviously is not what has come to pass. So I didn't really get interested in, let's call it communications of any kind until middle school and high school, and that was when I was getting into theater a little bit. The pivot I'll hone in on is actually fast forwarding all the way until about 2010 or so. Which is I was a professional actor for about 10 years, Broadway, film, and TV. But what I began to discover is that even more interesting than portraying characters on stage, I became totally fascinated by how people learn to do that activity. And so I started becoming really obsessed about how can you help people be more effective and calmer and more themselves in front of audiences. So this was a somewhat natural evolution into that. The biggest thing is that we really developed a way in which to use embodied cognition. And by that, I mean getting people to use their bodies to build habits. So, like the adage of learning to ride a bicycle and you never forget. And we developed a whole suite of kinesthetic tools to help people be more effective. So they're a little bit related to theatrical training, but not really, because I kept hiring actors to try to be coaches within our firm, and they looked at me a little bit baffled when I would teach them some of these exercises. I really discovered as an actor, half my time on stage was slightly equivalent to torture. Painful, agonizingly self-conscious, hyper-aware of every little thing, and relentlessly self-critical. Many, many artists out there, and certainly most performing artists out there, can relate to that. And what I discovered was that if I could put my focus on something very concrete, it was literally the only way I could navigate through those moments of like really painful self-consciousness. What I discovered was that the more that I thought about it, the worse I felt. And the more I obsessed about my feelings and my pain and things like this, the worse I actually felt. And what I discovered was that simply doing, putting the focus on doing, And doing behaviors and just putting one foot in front of the other actually led to much greater healing and greater escape, deliverance, all those sorts of words. For many people, public speaking is equivalent to agony. If you give them very concrete things that they can do and succeed at, they can get past this agonizing moment and experience a little tiny brief moment of victory. And from that moment of victory, you can build and build and build. And pretty soon, they've established a completely different kind of muscle memory that can help them succeed. One of the first profound experiences I had individually coaching someone is when I dreamt up this Lego block idea, because he was having a really difficult time memorizing anything. And so what I was trying to get him to do was to give himself just a moment longer before all the terrible, self-critical, berating voices came alive in his brain. And so I had him share one idea at a time and stack a Lego block at the end of each idea. It gave him something to do rather than, you're terrible, you can't memorize anything, what a terrible communicator you are. He had a distraction, something he had to do. And then in that moment, this total miracle happened, which his brain had a moment to think and actually recall the information he was trying to remember. So it was this really powerful moment of kinesthetic learning. From there, I've just developed these exercises working with real life communicators, both very high stakes communication situations like presidential candidates for debate prep, but also people much more, junior, which would be like high school students trying to get better at speaking so they can give a good oral report.
Yeah, quite a wide range. I remember the first time I encountered a challenge speaking. If I wasn't in a good headspace, my vocal cords would constrict or something, and I'd have to clear my voice 7 times. Super annoying.
Yes. So blushing, turning beet red, dry mouth. There's a whole bunch of things that people experience that are these physical manifestations of feeling tremendously nervous.
And so your process is often to try and work through I don't know if you call it the psychosomatic part, but the emotional response, the nerves, before diving into maybe more of a tactical approach.
Yeah. You use the tactics to unlock what I call a virtuous cycle of good communication. So you essentially fix the problem with these kinesthetic tools. They use embodied cognition. They change the pattern dramatically. And then once the pattern is changed, what also tends to change is all those automatic responses that are happening when the pattern is not going well. So there was a person I worked with one time who would always blush very, very intensely. And I mean instantly. She would start public speaking and instantly turn beet red. And she felt terrible about this and very self-conscious. And so the first thing she said to me is, I have to stop turning red. And I said back to her, that's not true. You have to stop moving your feet. She looked at me rather blankly. And what was going on was that she would begin speaking, and totally different than how she would stand or use her body if she was talking to a friend at the proverbial water cooler. She would begin to relentlessly shift her weight back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, almost like miniature pacing, but very rapid pacing. At the same time, she'd be turning beet red, and she'd be trying to hide this by continually smoothing back her hair over her face, trying to almost camouflage this activity with this motion of her hands over and over again. So I actually crouched down and I gave her feet some physical feedback to find stillness. I tapped on the top of her feet, put some books on top of her feet to keep them anchored to the ground. And when she did that, all of a sudden, magically, she actually took a breath in. Her diaphragm dropped down, her lungs filled with air, and her entire communication instrument became still. And all of a sudden, she spoke more slowly for a moment. She breathed in. She got a better idea. She realized she actually had something to say to start the speech off, and she didn't blush.
Sometimes you have to act your way into proper thinking instead of trying to think your way into proper acting, right?
100%. If 1,000% was a thing, I would say 1,000%. But 100%, yes, precisely. Actors know this as inside out versus outside in approaching of a character. You can see this in other aspects of life too. I mean, anyone who has become aware of some of the sort of approaches or focuses for health and wellness and mental health, you hear people talk about saying out loud each morning some gratitudes, or doing these physical things that are reminding you of some of the mindsets that you want to keep. And yes, absolutely. I mean, if you want to go religious for a second, think of all the religious traditions in the world and how very often, if there's a level of devotion that is trying to be unlocked, they actually do physical rituals, sometimes even regimens. And yes, these ways of acting, and if you want to use sort of philosophical language, acting virtuous can unlock positive feelings too.
So almost an anchoring and through your physical actions. One of the things just not to do a perfect segue here, this will just kind of take us a different road, but I have to ask for our listeners the 5 P's of vocal variety. I'd love to hear what the 5 P's of vocal variety are because I've learned how important vocal variety is.
Yeah. The first thing I should say is I did not invent vocal variety. Humans use vocal variety. We've been using it as long as we're human. And there's some really important reasons why we use it, which we can get into. But let's cut to your question, which is these 5 P's. And those 5 P's are pace, pitch, pause, power, and placement. Probably the first 4 are instantly familiar. Let's go through them quickly. Pace is speed, so that's fast and slow. Pitch is the note on a musical clef, high or low, so high or low. Pause is exactly what it sounds like, silence, and maybe even varied lengths of silence. Power is just another word for volume, so that's loud and soft. And then placement is probably the only one that's not instantly familiar. Placement means where is the sound placed in your body? A big misconception that people have about speaking is that it's a totally cognitive activity. Like, if I think of smart words, I will say smart words. But it's actually a physical activity. It takes 100 muscles to do what you and I are doing right now. And it's a physical activity. I mean, even just the act of enunciation, if you think for a moment, even just saying the word enunciation, how deeply physical that is. That final P of placement, just to be very clear, because sometimes people get a little confused about this. That means where the sound is placed in your body. So the easiest example to think about is if you have a friend with a really nasal voice, what's happening technically is the sound is only amplifying in like the nasal passages in the nasal area of the face. So that's if P, placement. And we use these 5 Ps of vocal variety to do a whole bunch of really important purposes, like convey meaning, convey emotion, create surprise, and more. But those are the 5 Ps.
It's amazing. And as you keep going, I just, I do actually a lot of interpretation of these lessons with my kids because it's so relevant right now.
Yeah.
And, your voice and communication is like one of the most essential things that I want to make sure they can do because it's so critical to human relations. So anyway, I love all of this training as a parent just as much as a professional.
Yeah. Let's talk about kids for a second. So we are actually in the midst of a real crucible moment in which how our kids learn to speak is a little bit under threat because they spend so much time looking at these devices right here. And for those of you who are just listening, of course, I'm holding out my cell phone. And because they're not actually kind of learning interpersonal behavior and interpersonal dynamic in the same three-dimensional, 24/7 kind of way that previous generations did, it's fraught. It's in a little bit of danger right now. And I applaud you for taking your 1.5-year-old's development seriously because it matters. And we take these skills for granted. We should not.
I don't know how much international work you do, but do you find change based on the geography someone's grown up in, like a German person who's working on public speaking versus someone who's French or Korean, how that impacts those 5 Ps?
Yeah, for sure. So to answer the question, yes, I've worked with folks on most of the continents of the globe and all kinds of different walks of life. For many years when I lived in New York City, I taught at Columbia Business School in the PhD program. And a lot of the folks who get their PhDs at Columbia speak English as a second or third or fourth language. I coach in the startup world a lot. And a lot of the founders who are building companies in the US speak English as a second or third or fourth language and oftentimes hail from somewhere else. And there's 2 ways I would suggest we think about this. On the one hand, there are the core things that humans do, and we do them all over the world. And that's partly because we are communication instruments. Communication is not a sidecar to being human. We built this incredible system of spoken language to be able to team up and gain an evolutionary advantage over somebody else or some other creatures, or stop the marauding, cave bears or whatever it is. So this is just part of being human. But then on top of that core, there is endless complexity with how different languages work. So yes, there are these changes, these differences all over the place. And then oftentimes what you're trying to do, though, no matter what culture, is not unlock how an American would speak or how a German would speak or how a Brit would speak, but you're trying to unlock how that person would speak. But crucially, when they are not thinking about themselves and how they speak, but thinking about the person they're trying to reach. And all of what we think of as the behaviors of presence or the behaviors of confidence, that means enunciation and eye contact and gestures and all the rest, these come out flawlessly when we're in that activity of really, truly trying to reach the other person. So no matter the culture that I'm working in, that's what I'm trying to help people unlock.
So important. What do you see as the bigger challenges as it relates to not just vocal variety, but speaking in general for salespeople? What are some of the common concepts you end up leaning into the most with people who are in that profession?
I'm going to offer a tactical suggestion first because it's so useful and so relevant to selling, and you can do it today and make your life better right away. I teach an exercise and a skill called the exercise is called finger walking. The skill is called linguistic precision, which means essentially, are you choosing words or are words just choosing you? So the exercise is simply when you're practicing asking questions and getting better at doing that, you walk your fingers across a table or desk, choosing each and every single word that comes out of your mouth. The finger steps are the equivalent of the act of choosing words. So in a sense, you're walking your ideas across a table. Now that's the skill. But the way to apply it, if you're in a selling situation, is to practice asking single questions with linguistic precision. So there's no filler, no non-fluencies. And then at the end of the question, draw an imaginary question mark in silence. Now, this is really powerful for people in a sales role because what you'll see is that oftentimes they're great at chit chat. They're great at rapport building. They're really good at asking questions to learn more about the person. And then they get to the crucial moment of asking for a next meeting or asking for the business, and their communication falls apart. And they ask like 9 questions in a row, and they talk really quickly, and they have a bunch of stumbles, and they go, and they back up, and don't, and all of it crumbles. And so you're practicing this very singular skill of asking one question with linguistic precision and then tolerating relaxed silence at the end so that you build the muscle of saying something like, how would you like to move this forward? When would you like to meet again? Is there anyone else that we should loop into this conversation? And these kind of what we call, closing questions. And very often, sales folks will have a moment or two within interactions that feel really fraught for them. And if they can build that skill, single questions with linguistic precision and relaxed silence at the end, it really helps them.
That's great. That's a great technician way to look and reverse engineer successful communication. You have this engineer mind about you that's allowed you to extrapolate the tools to make someone a good speaker.
Yeah, you ask really insightful questions. I don't actually relate to having much of an engineer's mind. I think I have much creative artist's mind or even an inventor's mind. Creativity is a thing that I'm pretty much addicted to. What I would say is that the engineering concept is right in a certain way, which is I became frustrated with how stymied people were by really bad advice. And I don't mean to say bad advice like they're being sabotaged by people, but bad advice sounds like this. Just be yourself. Just be conversational. Just be natural. These sorts of things are intended to relax the person you're talking to, but they don't, because all they do is make the person think more about themselves. And they're not relaxed. They don't feel like themselves. They don't feel conversational. They feel perhaps rocked with self-consciousness. As I became interested, like, how can you get in there when someone has been really messed up and engineer them for greater success by setting up their physical and their vocal communication instrument for success? I help set them up for success, but it's them who's doing it. When they have, like an engineer, set themselves up, set their physical and vocal communication instruments up for success, all of a sudden their brain is dazzling and it does what it's incredibly good at, which is thinking about ideas. Now that it's not totally jammed up with anxiety and multitasking of don't be nervous, don't look like an idiot, don't look like a fraud, don't mess up, don't, all of a sudden, brilliant things come out of their mouth. And if we think of part of speaking as this act of being present and being focused on the other person, you can't be present if you're thinking about all the stuff you forgot or anxious about all the stuff you're about to forget. So very often written materials, although intended to be a support, very often they cannot be that helpful because it puts you in the past or the future endlessly. And the act of speaking is a physical one. You're not going to be giving someone a PDF with a bunch of bullets on it. You're turning air into sound and then sound into words. You're doing it real time, and it's being received real time. So anything you can do to help yourself be in the present, as opposed to, those two other time zones that are not that helpful, can be really powerful. Because here's the funny thing. I've actually helped many people experience that, wow, I'm better when I'm not quite so anchored to my notes. The hard part is getting them to have the trust and faith to actually try and test it without it and kind of get their sea legs with that, because it takes some bravery of letting go.
Yeah, I love that. And I, I'd have to include this question because I think of sales and acting and how they're similar in so many ways. In sales, I'm very clear. You have a sales script. There's a purpose in remembering it because the words do matter to an extent, but not so much to the extent that it affects the emotion of the conversation. In acting, this is the part in the world I don't know. And so I would love your thoughts. I don't know how often the director's so hard on getting the exact words where you have to get caught up in the words, or if you don't rehearse enough to know all the paragraphs of information, it creates that trauma cycle of, am I, saying the right line, or if you're allowed to be emotionally engaged. How does that work in acting? And what's your take on scripts versus no scripts in communication?
So you have to promise to interrupt me a lot in this next answer, okay? Because that's a big, juicy question, and we could do a whole separate podcast just on that question, okay? It depends on the version of stage performance. Improv, there's no script. There may be a couple pretenses or a couple starting points, but then there's no script at all. That's part of the delight. Sort of like watching jazz musicians improvise. You get to watch people impromptu come up with these hilarious and amazing and heartfelt real-time scripts. It's totally astonishing. On the other side, you've got classical texts, Shakespeare, Chekhov, things like that, where oftentimes the script is so well known that if you really had a line flub, some of the audience might, hey, he forgot that word. In general, stage acting is required to be a bit more precise than film acting in a couple different ways. So film acting, as long as you're not having to do a bunch of takes in which lines are piggybacking 100% on each other, then you may have some freedom and the director may want to take just the best take. So an example of this is if you're watching serial drama, Law and Order, those sorts of things, there's quite a bit of latitude with the script. Other times there's not. And it also depends on the playwright or the screenwriter. So there really is some nuance there. But the place I want to do a tiny deep dive, though, is actually about this idea of scripting. Stage actors, what they're striving for is the exact opposite. That it's not a activity of trying to remember and a burden of mental memory, but rather that the process of learning this language actually informs them. And so these words become irreplaceable. These words actually teach them who the character is. And if they really get behind the words, they actually teach them what the action often is. I mean, as an example, here's a piece of poetry. I question things and do not find one that will answer to my mind, and all the world appears unkind. Now, if you listen to that, a bunch of those words have final voiced consonants. Question things, do not find one that will answer to my mind. Final voice consonants just mean consonants that have vocal tone, de, ne, those sorts of things. So if you really get behind that language, it begins to activate a sense of onomatopoeia, which is the word sounds like the thing that it is. And all those final voice consonants that can be drawn out actually give you some indication of what the character is doing, which is essentially searching and trying to squeeze every possible answer because they're answerless. They cannot find the thing they're looking for. So I don't mean to get too, dramatic or artsy with this whole thing, but actors often rely on the words. It's not trying to master them all and it's a burden. No, those words are their tool. They're their superpower in many ways. Now, what the heck does that have to do with public speaking? The same thing, which is if you have a script, first of all, you have to learn a script, learn it physically and learn it with variety. Don't rehearse the same way every time. 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 You're memorizing vocal variety. You're not memorizing the ideas. So move around in space. Walk like an elephant, slowly, big swinging arms through the room, saying the words. And the next time, whisper it into your phone like you're at a library, trying not to get scolded by the librarian. So you're learning the ideas, but you're not memorizing vocal variety. Also, get to know the ideas in what you're sharing, not just the words on the page. In fact, I often suggest that people write out their scripts like a poem. Make it look how the ideas make sense, not just how the word processor has divvied it up on the page. That has nothing to do with the ideas in the lines. It just has to do with how many characters fit on a line of text. It's a big topic. It's a worthwhile question you ask, but I also don't want to give you a whole soap opera on this one question.
No, I mean, it was great. And you've split up the little pieces of nuggets of wisdom really well. Michael, I hate to even end this interview because I feel like we're just scratching the surface. There's like another 3 hours in us. Where can everybody go to learn more about your work?
Sure. 3 simple places. For the book, it's just don'tsayum.com. Just the title of the book.com, don'tsayum.com. My company's name is GK Training, and that's the same URL, gktraining.com. And then you can find me on LinkedIn, Michael Chad Hoeppner.
Wonderful. Well, I will be looking at your resources for sure. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the interview and thank you for the really interesting questions. I know that can also sound like lip service, like every guest is like, what a great question. You're so smart, but really fun to get to answer.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And thanks for listening.